Let me control it. You all don't control it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Very welcome to this episode of Trade Winds, where we will talk about trade in Asia and the Pacific. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I am a senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I am very honored today to have two guests who has a lot of experience of trade. A warm welcome to Minister S. Iswaran, who is Minister for Transport and Minister in charge for Trade Relations in Singapore. And also a warm welcome to Senator Simon Birmingham, who is Liberal Senate Leader and Shadow Foreign Minister for the Liberal Party of Australia, and also a former Minister for Finance, Trade and Education in Australia. And I want to have full disclosure to say that when I was Trade Commissioner, we were negotiating and discussing together. So it's very nice to see old friends here again. And thank you so much for accommodating to the time zone. It must be quite late in Singapore and Australia. Before the pandemic, we already saw a tendency of increased protectionism in the European Union and in the US. And this has been reinforced during COVID. The Biden administration has clearly stated that it does not want to do trade agreements involving market access. And the EU has done several trade deals, but they've been waiting for quite some time, waiting to be ratified. Maybe this is changing now with the conclusion of the EU-New Zealand trade agreement, but there's still a lot of talk about strategic autonomy. But in Asia and in the Pacific, we have, on the contrary, seen a very dynamic development with the implementation and entry into force of several trade agreements. There is the CPTPP. In the world of trade, there's a swamp of acronyms. This is the former TPP concluded by the Obama administration, where the US then withdrew. It means Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And both Australia and Singapore are partners together with 10 other countries. You're also partners, both countries, of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and Singapore is one of the founding members of the Digital Economy Partnership that just entered into force. And I don't know if Australia is considering joining. We can come back to this. There's a lot of acronyms in this world, but there we are. So these agreements are in force, and you are both involved in bilateral agreements as well, and very active in the discussions about reforming and strengthening WHO. There is a group of countries called the Ottawa Group, led by Canada, where Singapore, Australia, and a dozen others are involved to try to promote and propose reforms of modernization of the WHO. So there's a lot of things happening in your part of the world, as opposed to the slightly gloomy mood in the parts of my world. So why don't you give us a picture a little bit, starting with Minister Iswaran. What's the trade mood in Singapore right now? And how do you feel about all these, not only acronyms, but all these trade agreements and what they can achieve?
Yep. Well, thank you, Cecilia. First of all, good evening to everyone. It's evening here at 9 o'clock at night. And also, thank you for inviting me to participate in this month's Trade Winds event. So I thought maybe I'd just sketch out broadly where Singapore is and how we are going about our trade and economic engagement in terms of the broad strategies. And then perhaps, and then after listening to Simon, engaging in a dialogue would be more interesting. So first, to state the obvious but the essential, we are in turbulent times. And, our attention globally has been absorbed by an array of challenges, from inflation and high energy prices to supply chain disruptions. And whilst there's the silver lining and some relief from the post-pandemic recovery, there's also been quite a bit of pushback against open trade and globalization. And we are seeing major economies adopting protectionist measures in an attempt to preserve their national interests. And I suppose I want to start by saying that from our perspective, these challenges, which are essentially global and highly interconnected, they really cannot be addressed by countries turning inwards or acting individually. And we feel that it's essential that governments resist the quick fixes, such as trade tariff increases, which may yield some short-term political benefits, but they are at the expense of profound long-term harm to trade and economic growth. So, especially in these challenging times, our view is that the global community must redouble its efforts to steward and grow the global commons. And in particular, we should reinforce key multilateral institutions such as the WTO, which is crucial to enabling the rules-based trading system that we believe will benefit all countries. The Geneva package, adopted recently at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, covered pandemic relief as well as agreements on digital trading and fisheries subsidies. It is a testament to the merit of working together in overcoming global challenges. But we can do more to strengthen the WTO. I think both Cecilia and Simon, you'd be very familiar with this. And it's also important that we ensure that it remains relevant to addressing 21st century issues, notwithstanding the diversity of interests amongst the WTO membership. So one potential pathway is through plurilateral initiatives and efforts, such as the Joint Statement Initiatives and Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions, which have had good support from the membership of the WTO. And we will continue from Singapore to be a supporter of such efforts that could serve as stepping stones towards eventual multilateral outcomes. Beyond the WTO, we think that countries should work together to deepen economic engagement and trade engagement at other levels. And this is where trade agreements such as the CPTPP that you mentioned, and also RCEP, if I can add to the alphabet soup, and also the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the IPEF. I think they are all examples of regional initiatives that can complement and promote multilateral cooperation. We have and will continue to support these initiatives, which are in line with our long-standing commitment to an open, rules-based, and inclusive global trading order. We also think that these initiatives can pave the way for new and creative ideas. So the IPEF, under the IPEF, there is a Pillar 3, which is a forward-looking initiative that has the potential to significantly deepen the US's engagement with our region on clean energy and decarbonization, which can help members achieve their climate goals and also grow the green economy. I also want to touch briefly, apart from the multilateral and the plurilateral, I think there are two new and important frontiers which we should be focused on. The first is digitalization. Clearly, digital connectivity is the 20th century analog of trade and physical trade connectivity. So every effort that we can undertake in that regard for the movement of bits and bytes across borders, I think, going to be critical. So as you might be aware, we have embarked on digital economy agreements. We have the DEPA with New Zealand and Chile, and 3 countries, China, Korea, and Canada, have also applied to join. We also have bilateral digital economy agreements with Australia, with the UK, and with South Korea. And we have initiated discussions with the EU as well. And we're looking at doing so with more partners, because again, this is part of that matrix of plurilateral initiatives that can come together to create a larger multilateral outcome. The other driver is obviously sustainability, given that climate change is an existential threat. But at the same time, I think our efforts to find sustainable solutions and decarbonize industry, I think it will yield interesting opportunities and for both businesses and for our people. So we are working on green economy agreements as well as a kind of parallel track. And this is really to establish rules and standards not found in traditional FTAs, such as non-tariff barriers on environmental goods and services. And we do hope that these sorts of bilateral and multilateral initiatives will accelerate the transition of countries towards a green and sustainable future. So I've sort of briefly sketched out what we are doing and how we are going about it. We are focused at the multilateral level because we do believe that we need to have that foundation as the basis on which we push forward on the trade agenda. we're also working on a series of plurilateral initiatives, as I've outlined. And we've got these new frontiers in digital and green, which we also believe yield significant possibilities for the future. So we're looking forward to working with all our like-minded partners, many of whom are on this panel and I'm sure in the audience here as well, so that we can take this agenda forward and set a constructive pathway for trade and economic engagement globally. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for this introductory words and for giving a little bit of picture from Singapore. Simon, Australia, how do you see it? You are part of all these acronyms as well as having a lot of bilateral agreements as well. How is the debate? I mean, you follow this, you're no longer trade minister, but you follow it on behalf of your party as a shadow minister. How do you see it from your part of the world?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Cecilia, and thank you so much to you for the invitation and to the Peterson Institute for hosting us in this forum, and particularly to you, Minister Iswaran, for joining a couple of X's, a couple of has-beens in Cecilia and I as former trade ministers for our regions in this forum. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to delve back into this really important policy space. The question that you framed for this forum was, is Asia the new home of dynamic trade? Now, in many ways, I would say Asia has been, or the Indo-Pacific region as we broadly refer to it, but particularly aspects of Southeast Asia, has been the home to dynamic trade, and right throughout Asia, up into North Asia, for some time now. And it's been the home of dynamic trade as a result of a few functions. The opening up of economies in our region, and particularly the opening up by China and reforms that occurred beginning in the 1970s, have revolutionised this part of the world, and they have demonstrated that economies and countries opening up to markets, embracing the opportunities of trade and the economic reform that comes from that, has real dividends, as you can see in this part of the world, that through the 3-4 decades that have ensued since, we've seen some millions, hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty and significant improvement of living standards right across the region. Faster improvements than any other part of the world, and trade has played a huge role and function in that. And at times like this, where we do see huge global challenges, it's important, never more so, I think, for us to tell and retell that story of the lived experience of what dividend has been provided. And from that, we've of course seen that the mere opening of market economies has indeed led to this surge of willingness and engagement in trade agreements. Some more ambitious than others in terms of the scale of opening up those trade agreements offer, in terms of the elimination of traditional trade and quota barriers, as well as the advancement in others. But all of these agreements certainly lifting the different participants to new levels of market openness and to new abilities to trade. And also some of them providing greater consistency in terms of the rules that apply. RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is a good case in point from the perspective of a country like Australia, and I suspect Singapore would be much the same. When India decided not to participate in RCEP, Australia was then confronted with a trade agreement with a bunch of countries with whom we already had trade agreements in place. We already had a trade agreement with ASEAN and with many of the individual ASEAN countries, as we did with Japan, with Korea, with Japan, and with New Zealand. But the benefits that RCEP provided was some incremental gains in terms of market access, but some real gains in terms of commonality of rules, commonality around rules of origin, and the ability to be able to work across the region. And especially now, as we look in the time where since RCEP was finalised, we've been struck by COVID, we've been struck by other disruptors that have driven greater discussion around questions of onshoring, of sovereignty or the like. RCEP provides the type of model where countries can enhance their resilience by getting the most out of supply chains, the most out of being able to have those common approaches to supply across the region. And I hope that that is what we see occurs. I agree with nearly everything that Minister Iswaran has said already in relation to the challenges, but opportunities still that exist in relation to multilateral cooperation. It was an enormous pleasure for me, as I'm sure it was for you too, Cecilia, to see the fisheries subsidies negotiations reach an outcome at the recent ministerial conference. We had all been hoping and working for that to be the case with the delayed ministerial conference as it was, hoping that there would be an outcome. And it is a demonstration that although there is more we may wish for, you can still get multilateral agreement around significant pieces of work like that, and pieces of work that enable us to achieve outcomes that are sustainable and help the environment, as well as helping to achieve trade and economic dividends, particularly for many less developed countries participating in that agreement. The continued march and work of the plurilaterals, more important than ever, as we do see fracturing in relation to some economic powers around the world, and particularly a real fracturing of the large economic powers and their different pursuits in terms of the trade agenda. The rightful isolation the world is taking in regards to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the right response. We face the challenges that have been there for some time now in terms of the United States and the need to pursue different trade approaches to be able to get engagement and consensus from the US than the traditional FTAs. I would dearly wish to see the US contemplate reconsideration of the CPTPP, but that is unlikely to happen under either a Democratic or a Republican administration in the near term. We should and must continue to advocate for that, but we have to also pursue the alternate types of strategies. And we also do face now real new challenges that do affect our region in particular, and perhaps the rosy outlook you painted from the way in which China has and is engaging. And Australia is acutely aware of that. If we look at Australian attitudes, there's a wonderful body of work that the Lowy Institute, a think tank in Australia, does in surveying Australians each year about their perspectives to other countries and their consideration of different foreign policy issues. On the question of free trade, it's got a really heartening response. It shows that in 2022, some 80% of Australians see free trade as being good for their standard of living. That's been an increase in recent years, and it's been a steady increase over a number of years, and shows that Australians do understand, as a trading nation, the benefits that accrue to us from doing so. But we can also see in that survey, when we look at some of the questions about other nations, the impact of China's more coercive and restrictive approaches to trade with Australia that have not lived up to the spirit of aspects of our China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and our other partnerships with there. Again, they have asked for some time a question about whether China is more of an economic partner or a security threat to Australia. And that data point shows that it has moved from, back in 2018, an economic partner seen by some 82% of Australians, down to, in 2022, just 33%. And of course, the security threat equation rising from 12% 4 years ago to some 63% in 2022. And I should stress this survey work was undertaken before the recent crisis surrounding Taiwan. So it does show that when we look at the questions around the social license that underpins government's ability to trade and the way countries behave with one another, that public sentiment can shift and pick up on that very, very quickly, and that has occurred clearly in Australia. That again requires us to go right back to the start of my remarks to make sure we sell into one another, to our communities and to communities elsewhere around the world, the dividends that open and free trade have provided. They have made big differences in lifting countries out of poverty. And of course, it is also the great pillar for security and stability wherever possible. But it will, I think, be increasingly important in terms of plurilateral architecture and the pursuit of bilateral arrangements for countries who share common values in support of a rules-based system, but also of market economies, and for a solid commitment to the rule of law within their own economies to work ever more closely together. And I certainly hope from an Australian perspective and a European Union perspective that can see the agreement we used to negotiate on finalised in terms of the Australia-EU agreement, and that hopefully across Europe there can be a sentiment that the challenges posed by Russia or China or a standoffish approach in terms of trade posed by the US means it's ever more important to work with those partners who do want to work with you. I think that is an approach we're all going to need to take.
Thank you for that. I certainly hope so as well. 80% in support of free trade, that's impressive figures in Australia, indeed. I want to talk about WTO in a little moment, but linger a little bit in the region still. China is a member of RCEP, and it entered into force just some months ago. So I guess it's still early times to evaluate. The CPTPP has been in force for a little bit longer, but probably also not long enough to really draw conclusions. But would you say that these initial agreements that you're both part of have been good for the economy, that we can already see, positive results and some new dynamics? Are they complementary or are they sort of competing? And we also see quite a lot of countries lining up to join. Costa Rica, I think, just recently applied to join. You have Ecuador, you have our friends in the UK, China, Taiwan. I think that the European Union should apply as well, but that's not for me to decide anymore. But how do you see this? Is this sort of another spaghetti bowl, or are they sufficiently defined to complement each other and to be as good as possible for your respective economies? But why don't you start, Minister?
I was going to defer to Simon, but okay. I think
Simon first.
Simon, would you like to go ahead first?
If you like, I'll give a quick response there. I think certainly CPTPP, we are seeing practical benefits already. Now, in the case of CPTPP, it did provide for Australia real market access gains in a number of different economies. And it also provided, for the first time ever, a trade agreement between Australia and Canada and a trade agreement between Australia and Mexico. And in those cases, particularly Mexico, it's played a critical role in referencing, and I don't want to dwell on it, but in referencing some of China's actions, which has included tariffs on our barley industry. We have since then been able to send our first ever shipments of barley to Mexico under the terms of the CPTPP. So there's a very live practical example of where trade barriers have suddenly popped back up. We've been able to use it for positive outcomes elsewhere. And I think there, and with RCEP, I hope that we can see the continued growth of those gains. And I spoke in RCEP about the benefits of those common rules of origin. And they're the types of things that can indeed, hopefully, overcome some of the spaghetti noodle approach of overlapping trade agreements, that when you can get a good regional or plurilateral agreement in place and that can lay over the top of a range of bilateral arrangements, then you can manage to ensure you've got sufficient commonality of approaches to make life easier for businesses to engage across the region. You're right, there's been some significant interest in expanding CPTPP. I think the new Australian government will bring the same perspective to that as we had in government, which is that increased membership is welcome, so long as those new members can meet the high standards of CPTPP. It is a high standard agreement in terms of the rules, in terms of the trade liberalisation, in terms of its scope in areas of digital trade and the like as well. And so they're all critical benchmarks to make sure that new entrants can accede in a way that maintains that high standard.
Yeah, so if I can just complement Simon's comments, I would say first, it's not just a mantra, but it's something that has been borne out from experience. These FTAs and these regional agreements and bilateral agreements have been beneficial for us in tangible economic terms. You would be interested to know, Cecilia, that the EU-Singapore FTA, which came into force at the end of 2019, if I remember correctly, And, it ran straight into the maelstrom of the COVID-19 pandemic. And despite that, over the last 2 years, actually, we've seen bilateral trade grow between the EU and Singapore. And I think, and interestingly, it has also been of benefit to the SMEs and so on. We've been tracking this. So the general proposition that trade agreements are intrinsically beneficial because they lower the barriers and all the usual things that we talk about, I think continues to be borne out. Where agreements like the CPTPP, I think, add value beyond the points that Simon has made. For example, it has, at least at that time, it set ambitious aspirations for the digital side. It had its own set of elements around that. And that, I think, started the frame. But of course, today we are now moving beyond that in terms of digital economy agreements and various other ideas. So I tend to think of them where, we can think of them as a spaghetti bowl, or you could think of them as part of a kaleidoscope or a lattice structure. You shake it and you get a pattern and it looks good. And the most important thing is that the whole must be coherent. It cannot be that they are working at odds to each other. So I think that is the key thing. So whether it is scope of the agreements, where we are very focused on making sure the agreements yield tangible benefits, which is a way we've all approached it. I remember in our negotiations and all as well. But at the same time, also allowing us to perhaps pave the way for new ground, break new ground, set bars so that we can keep pushing the boundaries. I think these are some of the areas where when you bring the smaller groups together of like-minded players together, it helps, I think, take the agenda forward.
That's really interesting. And you both refer to the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is yet another acronym in this discussion, which was launched by President Biden just 3 months ago. And both of your countries are partners of it. That is not a trade agreement in the sense that it's sort of market access and taking away tariffs and so on, but it has a trade element.
Yes.
Is this also complementary in your views? I mean, if from the Chinese point of view, they would say this is an anti-China agreement, but it has elements related to trade with standards and with green technology, as you mentioned, and others. So does this also fit into this bowl, and can it develop into something more trade-oriented?
Let me come in on that first. I would say that the IPEF is a different sort of trade architecture. And what I mean by that is it is an architecture that is really adapted to the kind of content and circumstances. And so within this framework, one can envisage that there will be elements which are in the more conventional, legally binding kind of areas. For example, one could look at trade facilitation, etc., as a case in point. There could be elements which are more where we are working to establish common standards, etc., but we are not quite ready yet to anchor them in agreements, but it doesn't inhibit us from having this collaborative framework to evolve that. And then there are elements which are actually very much more at the exploratory end of the spectrum. So I think this framework, whilst it doesn't fit the conventional model and therefore may raise questions about its value proposition, I see its value proposition in two ways. The first is, it is, I think, by its own construct, designed to adapt to the evolving needs in the economy, especially when you're talking about some of the higher tech areas, where really to say that we can come up with rules today that will be binding and govern the activities of tomorrow is really hubris. So what we really need is a more dynamic model, a more flexible model. And that's where an agreement like this comes into play. The other benefit of this, which of course, bears stating, is that we just talked about how the US did not participate in the TPP, but this gives the US the opportunity to re-engage with this agglomeration of countries in this part of the world. And I think that is a strategic a benefit that should not be overlooked, because we are talking about an engagement at a time, as you've observed, within the US, the political environment is not necessarily a propitious one for trade deals. And in fact, Catherine Tai has said as much, but and emphasized that labor concerns will be key, etc. But this allows the US to engage with flexibility whilst addressing some of their domestic concerns as well, I think. So we really need, if I may put it this way, I think the IPEF is, a solution for the context and for the times, and it does yield certain benefits. Is it the only formulation that can work? No. Is it the best? Not necessarily. But certainly for this context and for these sets of partners, I think it's a workable proposition.
What's your view, Simon, on this?
I would concur with all of those observations. To the second one made in terms of the crucial role it plays in providing a framework for US engagement in the Indo-Pacific, that cannot be, the importance of that cannot be overstated. It is crucial that we do see some engagement, just as you've noted that trade terms are, of course, full of acronyms. Also, foreign policy and trade space is full of euphemisms, and people talk much of the strategic competition within our region and within the Indo-Pacific, and particularly that strategic competition being code for the different battles or challenges that we see in the way in which China and the United States engage across the region. Well, without a framework for economic engagement, there is no competition. And so it is a crucial pillar for the US to have this framework, to embrace this framework. It's critical on both sides of the Pacific, in the sense of ensuring that on our side, the United States is seen as being an economic partner who wants to be a partner, who wants to engage, who has plans for investment, supports that investment, wants to be able to pursue modernising agendas in areas of the digital economy or the like. And it's also crucial when you go all the way back to Washington to make sure that there is also a framework that ideally members of Congress across the aisle can actually commit to and buy into, that doesn't come with the challenging political circumstances of the TPP or of other FTA type models, but at least gets them back onto the path of being able to talk about that international economic engagement in ways that are constructive, and indeed, where necessary, where they can also talk about it in ways that underpin the security and other considerations for why they need to engage with other parts of the world like this. And yes, then in the detail of it, it does provide potential and opportunity to be able to make progress, and in some spaces, perhaps to make progress, such as in areas of digital economic cooperation, with the greater type of flexibility than a traditional FTA would necessarily achieve. And so there where we should certainly try to harness those opportunities and encourage the US to move along at pace.
This is a more of a sort of sectoral approach. You can engage in certain areas, but not yet in others. And the IPEF is also constructed that way, that countries can join certain areas of cooperation, but not necessarily all of it. And maybe this is the way that we have to muddle through right now in order to get countries on board. And you both refer to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, who just concluded 2 months ago. It's ministerial that has been postponed several times because of COVID. And despite quite a lot of pessimism, there were progress, surprisingly a lot of progress, I would say. You both mentioned the fisheries agreement, which is an achievement indeed, and there were progress on patent waiver, and there was a commitment to come back with a more sort of comprehensive reform agenda eventually. All that is fine. Now, of course, it has to enter into force. There's an agreement to do it, but now it has to be done as well. And WTO, I think it was revealing that at least, there were results. All those gloomy voices said that WTO is dead and they will not recover. They were wrong, but now we have to move on, showing that it is actually moving, not very quickly, but steady and slowly. So how do we go from MC, the ministerial conference in June? What needs to be done in order to sort of reinstall WTO's role on the arena? You both refer to the importance of multilateral rules and international norms, and WTO is that forum, of course. Can be others as well, but that's the basis where 164 countries are still members.
Yeah, I don't know, Simon, do you want to have a crack at it first, or?
Away you go on this occasion.
Yeah, no, so I would say that first, there were the naysayers, and there still may be naysayers about the WTO and the, MC12 and so on. But really, if you consider what the alternative could have been, actually what we have is really a very productive outcome. And I think it's credit to all the member states eventually, leaning in and making work, and also to the DG, Ngozi, and so on. I think they've all put in a lot of work in the secretariat there. I would say, though, the key challenge for the WTO, and both of you are very familiar with this, so I won't belabor the point, other than to say that we really need to bring the WTO decisively into the 21st century. And this is where the work around digital arena, because for e-commerce, for example, we now have extended the moratorium, but it's essentially, it's a moratorium. We're in the 21st century where e-commerce is a way of life. In our part of the world, e-commerce is, the digital commerce is growing at a much faster rate than all the conventional pathways. And so I think we really need to come to some convergence on that in a manner. And so both in terms of scope and in terms of pathway, the WTO needs to start innovating. And that's where I think one of the big focal points ought to be. And I would add into that mix green economy related work as well, because in the end, when you talk about non-tariff barriers around environmental goods and so on and things like that, again, it starts to become issues. So in my view, we need to start work on this. And then in terms of the modalities for achieving this, some of the things that we have tried to do within the WTO and which have borne fruit to some extent, like the JSIs and so on, I think these are useful models. In other words, within the auspices of the WTO, to start moving with a group of countries and then allowing others to come on board when they're ready or with some flexibility. In a way, it's an extension of the discussion we just had on IPEF and so on. We really have to ask ourselves the question whether the model of having a comprehensive, legally binding package deal negotiated is going to be the way forward for a multilateral organization like WTO, whether that's going to yield productive outcomes for us, given the plurality and the diversity of the members, or whether we ought to consider other options which will keep, it has to be an open architecture, it has to be an inclusive architecture, but it's also a flexible architecture that allows us to then, find the pathways to move forward on some of the pressing issues. Otherwise, the risk for us is that, it'll be seen as irrelevant. It provides a baseline, but it's a very, a baseline that people take for granted. So, so that's my main thing about the WTO. I would say, of course, we can talk about other aspects about it in terms of, the tribunals, etc., and so on. But I think this is the key area for me, which I think we need to work on collectively.
So, Cecilia, I think that for starters, when it comes to the WTO and some of the debates that are had, we always have to consider the extreme opposite, which is the alternative to a multilateral rules-based system is to not have one. And in not having one, we face then real challenges in terms of the breakdown of what has been achieved over decades. And the recent ministerial conference, I think, showed that even under the stresses and duress that the world has faced through COVID, through an increase in conflict, and indeed through changes in attitudes to trade in different parts as we've canvassed, you still had ultimately a ministerial conference that achieved progress and achieved some things that were significant and important in that regard. And so it's a demonstration that with all of those pressures, I think there is still a universal value that most can come to around having an international rules-based system in place. And we shouldn't underestimate the importance of something like the fisheries agreement for providing tangible benefits that go beyond the usual discussion on trade. And that in having something where we can tangibly point to sustainability and environmental outcomes as well is crucial to being able to continue to build and carry that support for an entity like the WTO, its work, and indeed the role that effective trading systems can manage to play for outcomes that go beyond pure ones around economic growth. And that will be crucial as we step through the challenges of confronting climate change and the way in which we deal with that. And it will be important that that cuts both ways in terms of recognising that countries will need to pursue different changes and approaches to be able to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement, but also that we have to be very clear in terms of the way the WTO operates, that those actions shouldn't become a means for covert trade sanctions or the like, and that there will be some real challenges that come to the fore, I suspect, in the WTO over the years ahead in that prism. I agree very much that the continued pursuit of plurilaterals as path leaders for other nations is crucial, and in areas of digital trade and digital economy, we should absolutely expect to see gatherings of members that do move ahead in faster ways and provide an example that, as long as it is open, others can then join and follow in on. And we cannot expect that progress can be made if we are endlessly waiting for complete unanimous participation and agreement. So being able to chart that path is a crucial one. Lastly, look, yes, it's been alluded to, I think confidence in the WTO does require, of course, all elements of it to be functional. And I would hope that we can see from the US and across the board a willingness to now try to get down to pursuing some of those administrative reforms or changes that are necessary to ensure the appellate body or an alternate structure is re-established in a functional way, because whilst the rules are an important part, the cooperation is the most vital part. Ultimately, this dispute resolution function does remain crucial, and particularly crucial when countries find themselves in difficult circumstances. And so you would hope, and we certainly hope, that we can see some willingness to re-engage there, which isn't necessarily about trade liberalisation, but at least about ensuring there's an umpire to enforce the rules.
Well, there's certainly a need for more globalization and more global rules and international frameworks. The discussion very much in Europe and in US and elsewhere as well is that globalization is dead. We talk about deglobalization or slowbalization, new words in the trade dictionary. But COVID, Russia's war in Ukraine, the climate crisis, and the food shortages as well show that we actually need more globalization and more international cooperation and more international rules. And you are certainly front runners in that in many respects. But of course, you sit very far away. I sit in Sweden. It's not far away from Ukraine and not far away from Russia. So we are very much affected both practically, but also emotionally by Russia's war in Ukraine and the atrocities committed there and the effects that it has on inflation, energy prices, commodity shortages, and so on. How I must ask, how are you affected by this? You are on the other end of the world, but of course, trade flows and supply chain shortages affect you as well, as you are so integrated in the global trading world.
Well, I would say that first, the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is a geopolitical dimension, there's a human dimension, and then there's the economic dimension. And the human dimension is something that obviously weighs heavily on all of us when we consider the plight of the people and the kind of suffering that's being wrought upon them. And it is the kind of thing that we have never thought possible. And now it has happened. It's even as recently as 9 months ago, no people would have given such a probability, such an event occurring, the probability of very low. For us, geopolitically, it is also very significant because Russia's actions against the Ukraine violate fundamental principles in terms of sovereignty and territorial integrity, basic principles that govern the way countries interact with one another. And these are principles that are important for all nations, but I think in particular for small nations like Singapore. So we have felt that this is something that goes well beyond just the immediate region because it has got broader implications for the whole world. And that is why we stepped forward to support the sanctions and took part, and implemented some of the sanctions as well. Because our objective was really to signal clearly where we stand as a nation and also to uphold those very core principles that we think are core for Singapore's own national interests and, future. In terms of the economic impact, well, I think, that food supply chains, energy supply chains have been affected. There's been a consequential knock-on effect. Energy in particular, because even before Russia's actions in the Ukraine, the energy prices were already rising. And that was because as we were coming out of the pandemic, the supply side crunch, because there was not that much investment in some of the key sort of assets, right? For example, for gas, etc. That was already having an impact. And then I think this has further aggravated it. Russia's actions have further aggravated it. So for us, I suppose, apart from the obvious and universally felt inflationary impact, the key thing that has come to the fore, of course, is, as you put it, supply chain resilience. And I think when we think about supply chain resilience, though, it is important to right-side the thinking, if you like, because it's not necessarily a case of therefore only doing friendshoring or something or reshoring or something like that. Because for Singapore, anyway, it's not an option. We're a small place. But we have traditionally and always focused on diversification. So whether it's food, whether it's energy, whether it's any of our other trade pattern flows and so on, we have focused on diversification as a way to ensure resilience. And so this recent experience has reinforced that conviction. And that's why we are working with all the partners to see how we can do this. And we should not see this as a defensive or an exclusionary construct, but more as a construct to ensure that we keep resilience at the forefront because you want to keep the flows going. In fact, during the pandemic, when, just to give you one specific example, quite apart from the impact of the Russia-Ukraine matter, when you had disruptions in the Suez Canal, when we had disruptions in some Chinese ports, our port became an important, what the industry calls a catch-up port, because they lost time in the Suez, they lost time at at some of the ports in China, for example, but they were able to recover it here because of our, not just the efficiency of the port, but the connectivity and therefore the time saving. So we need to think about supply chain resilience in different ways, and so that the outcome is one that we want and not something that might be unintended and perverse.
Celia, I think in Australia, as frankly in Singapore and Europe and around much of the world, the human reaction has been clear and one both of deep concern and of shock that this could happen in our lifetimes in the type of conflict on European soil that we are seeing. That's spilled over in Australian context when I referenced before some of that research work of places like the Lowy Institute in terms of threat assessments, the way people see that in the context of Russia, but also the way they see it in terms of challenges in our region. And you've been able to see that in much of the commentary around the escalation of tensions around Taiwan as well. Economically, to the nub of your question, we are a little bit of a mixed bag in that sense in Australia. As an exporter of gas, of coal, of grains and cereals, we have of course seen a real lift in relation to the prices that Australia is receiving for many of those commodities around the rest of the world, and that's driven some spikes in terms of
You froze there for a short moment, Simon.
It's frozen.
It's frozen.
oh.
Now you're back. Yes, you froze for a couple of seconds. You're back, yes.
Good. So I was saying we've seen that lift in terms of our trade surplus as a commodities exporter, but we haven't been immune from the inflationary impacts that so much of the rest of the world has seen, and in terms of energy costs within Australia and other inflationary impacts. And they've been compounded by some of the, indeed, disruptions to logistics and supply chains around the world. Australia sits largely at the end of many shipping routes. And so in Australia, discussions even of the practical, this is where Australia and Singapore, great friends though we are, and common approach we may have in many things, including the importance of respect for the sovereignty of small states, but you're not at the end of any shipping routes and we're at the end of many. And so even practical considerations about whether there are containers available for exports to get, or imports in supply chains to actually get in and out of the country have been genuine practical concerns, and the huge lift in costs that we have seen in relation to shipping, access to those containers and the like, feeding into those inflationary elements. And with that, feeding into some of those debates about where areas of self-sufficiency and resilience are necessary, flowing on from debates that were sparked earlier in COVID and have been heightened by other disruptions, including what we've seen in recent weeks. But all of that said, is globalisation dead, and what does all of this mean? My personal view is there remains certainly a risk of the bifurcation that people spoke of at different times in recent years. Do we see different parts of the world potentially split in terms of technological systems, other areas of trade and operation in different ways, and that creates real separations in parts of our economy and challenges in terms of some areas of engagement. But I don't see any prospect or possibility of a complete breakdown in globalisation when you look at the fundamentals of our economies, the extent in which trade has actually grown in many ways during COVID, and particularly that growth in e-commerce and digital trade that we have seen, which has put some of those pressures on global shipping as we've seen the volume of parcels and smaller goods moving around the world escalate in dramatic ways. And of course, with now a restoration of open borders and the like, I expect again to see a real surge in relation to the services economy and its role in terms of driving that trade exchange even further, not just in the movement of people, but of course in delivery of services through the types of online platforms that we are embracing right now, and for which the escalation in willingness and ability to use them has been so dramatically enhanced because of COVID.
Absolutely. Sometimes reality is moving in a different direction than the public rhetoric. We are more globalized than ever, and the fact that they managed so quickly to elaborate vaccines with cooperation all over the world in a historic quick time shows as well how important it is with the global international cooperation. We are approaching the end, but there is a question here from Mehmet Said Akman. You touched upon it, but he wants to know which particular areas should and could proceed under plurilateral initiatives so that they can support the multilateral trade system. I think you touched upon it, but if you want to add any comment on that, S or Simon?
I would say that focus on the digital and green areas is a case in point. And I think on digital, we should look at how we can facilitate the flow of data with all the precautions that are necessary from a personal data protection point of view, etc. Also in terms of protocols so that you have interoperability and so on. And then I think for green, because really the solutions lie in the global commons and the way we work together. So even things like carbon credits and how you interact, etc. All of these require cross-border solutions. And I think these are immediate areas we can work on, because there's a pressing need. And I think if we achieve outcomes, they will be tangible.
I would really add to that,
Simon? Yeah.
I'd agree with those, and would only really add continued opportunities in areas of health, pharmaceuticals potentially, but of course leveraging off of some of the challenges, but then goodwill shown as a result of COVID, that I think that provides real scope to.
Well, these are certainly areas where there's quite obvious evidence that global cooperation is needed. And if all countries cannot move at the same time, okay, let's make plurilaterals. They have worked before in the WTO context, they will work again. So hopefully this is something where we can see more results in the short term future. We are at the hour. I think you have both answered the question for today. It was, is Asia the new home for dynamic trade? It should have said Asia Indo-Pacific, to be fair. Maybe this is limiting it a bit, but I think you both answered with a sounding yes, and that other parts of the world can certainly learn from you and your optimism that trade is of course not the solution to all the problems, but it's certainly part of solving some of the problems, also the post-COVID recovery and the increase of cooperation and the sort of intriguing cooperation with trade, health, technology, digitalization, and so on. It certainly requires much more cooperation, and you have taken some very important and courageous steps, I think. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences, Simon and S. Thank you for staying up so late. I know it's a late hour in Singapore and even more in Australia, so thank you for your flexibility. Thank you to all of you who have been watching. Next time we will come directly from Geneva Public Forum and broadcast trade winds from there and discuss even more aspects of WTO cooperation. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Cecilia. Thank you.